This next couple years is going to be one of the greatest periods of consolidation in our industry that we're ever going to see. Make sure your internal house is in order before you go on the M&A warpath.
Welcome to Real Estate Leadership Unlocked. I'm Debbie Lariviere, founder of Monter Coaching, where we help brokerage owners, independent firm leaders, and team leads develop scalable and profitable businesses built on strategy, clarity, and performance. This conversation will get you thinking differently. Whether you're a seasoned broker, emerging leader, or the one making the next key hire, unlock transparently what it takes to lead in real estate today. Greatness is ahead. I want to welcome you to this month's masterclass on your brokerage valuation and how we're winning at our brokerage valuations, tips and tricks on how to elevate our value, key components of the valuations. I know Scott has done many of these, as I'll announce in our introduction, and how to avoid some of those common pitfalls that we bump into. We're also bumping into new laws and new requirements. So interested on how that's impacting our valuations. And we'll also look at some succession and legacy planning that applies to our teams out there as well as our brokerages. So looking at some of those pieces that we should consider as we age. I know all of us feel that we're going to sell homes forever. We're never going to retire. At least that's what I hear consistently. So have Scott chime in on that as well. So brief introduction of Scott. He is a partner in RealTrends Consulting, has handled over 1,000 valuations and acquisitions with his work with RealTrends. He's published articles on topics for trends, rankings, valuations, M&A, and more for RealTrends and Housing Wire. He's co-written several ebooks, and for being a guest on today's masterclass, you will also get a free download of one of his ebooks on valuing small and medium-sized firms. Prior to RealTrends, Scott has a 15-year background in business analytics and financial analysis in securities and business information sectors. He earned a bachelor's in finance and a bachelor's in entrepreneurship and small business management from the University of Colorado. Now, Scott and I are both football fans, so we won't hold that against you. Scott from the University of Colorado will say you've had a couple W's on the board recently, but we'll move past that for today. So Scott, we're honored to have you here sharing your expertise. I know I met you a few years back when I was at a RealTrends conference, and you've been a huge help to me and many of my clients looking for valuations for both acquiring businesses as well as being acquired. So I'm excited to have you here to share all of your insights with us, and I'll just kick it off by welcoming you and turning it over to you to get us started today.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be with you and to be talking about the thing that I love and the stuff that we do. And so it's a great honor, and go Buffs.
Okay, just for this one.
All right. I do have a daughter who goes to Auburn, so I've become a War Eagle fan. So we'll add that to the repertoire, but you know,
at least advancing you into the SEC.
That's true. I'm excited to be part of the SEC now, indirectly. But no, I'm happy to dive in. And the topics that you chose, Debbie, are very appropriate for kind of walking through the process of valuation, some components of valuation, things you need to look at, things you need to consider as you are considering either making acquisitions or doing an evaluation for yourself. And it's not always for an acquisition too. We get valuations in for a lot of different reasons. We do valuations. I'd say less than half of our valuations are actually for the purpose of a sale, probably about half. And some of them are intending to sell. They get the valuation to figure out that that's not what they want to sell at. So they, we plan with them on how to build value to eventually get to that point. But, and we do valuations for estate planning, succession planning, the unfortunate circumstances of death, divorce, partnership disputes. We're doing a lot of litigation right now with divorces for valuations. It's an interesting time. COVID, kind of as a side note, all of a sudden these families were forced to spend all this time together, and we're seeing a huge tick up in divorces over the last couple of years that are promulgated from COVID. So we're doing a lot of litigation support on the valuation side of things too. But one of the first things I think it's important to talk about is like you highlighted, Debbie, is the key components to a valuation. And I really think it's important and just kind of educational to understand, before we talk about the key components of valuation, is to really provide some context and some background on the history of brokerage valuation, because brokerages weren't always worth something. 50 years ago, there wasn't a lot of value in running a brokerage and owning a brokerage company. When you've got a business where your primary assets are independent contractors who can wake up the next morning and take their licenses down the street to your competitor, it was hard to try and find value in that and to build a business to develop value in something like that, where the vast majority of the value of your business is goodwill. It's your ability to keep agents together and to create a product and a culture and a business that is driven on people. And so it was about 50 years ago that really people figured out, there is actually value in brokerages. And, I guess to start, the definition of fair market value is what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller. And 50 plus years ago, there wasn't really willing buyers in this business until Coldwell Banker started acquiring brokerage firms. And this is back even in the days when brokers were retaining 50 cents on the dollar. They were keeping 50 cents on every dollar of commission that was earned, back in the 60s and previous to that, even into the 70s. And it wasn't really until some of these larger national scale firms started buying brokerage firms that people still really started to figure out, there's actually a value in these businesses. Coldwell Banker started making acquisitions in the 1970s, and actually Merrill Lynch, a lot of people don't know, was big into the brokerage industry back in the 1970s. And so they were acquiring brokerage firms. Into the 80s, Sears actually bought Coldwell Banker, and the S&Ls got into the brokerage business. That was a really interesting time. Merrill Lynch continued to expand via acquisitions. Obviously, as we know, things didn't go well on the S&L side of things. Sears quickly exited the business. Merrill Lynch exited the business, and there was kind of some topsy-turvy into how we were going to do this into the 90s. And really in the 90s is when we really started to see brokerages establish business value. And that was when companies like RealTrends, now called Anywhere, which eventually bought Coldwell Banker, and they now own the Century 21, the Sotheby's, Better Homes and Gardens. They own those brands, ERA. And Home Services of America, Warren Buffett's old company. They started in the 1990s. They started on a national scale, making these really large acquisitions and buying brokerage firms up in major metropolitan areas. And they got to a point where they got big enough to where the only way they can grow was via acquisitions. They obviously, every brokerage firm, no matter what size they are, whether it's a 5-agent firm or a 10 or 20,000 agent firm, they obviously really lean into organic growth. But when you get to a certain size, organic growth is very hard to achieve. And so acquisitions was really the main way these companies did it. And as time went on into the 2000s, we saw other entrants into the M&A market. We saw private equity firms jump in. Obviously, Compass in the mid 2000s really started to make itself known as a major national player. And so M&A became a lot more pervasive, not only on a national scale, but on the local and regional scale as well. And because M&A became a lot more active nationally, it became a lot more normalized regionally. And so a lot of smaller brokerages were starting to make acquisitions. Regional brokerages, like the Hanna companies, that operates in certain regions, they started making acquisitions. And so, first of all, sizes were doing it. And so it was these big national buyers that really made the market for brokerage valuations because of their M&A activity. And that value, the fact that brokerages have value now was really galvanized by the fact that we now have publicly traded companies that are residential brokerage firms, and so there's obviously formidable value in running a brokerage firm these days. And really over the last 35 years, since my partner Steve started this business, we've had to figure out how to understand and leverage this M&A activity to figure out how to price brokerages. And because we've been very active on the M&A side of things, we've understood how these acquisitions work, how these major national companies and even smaller local companies are pricing and valuing brokerage firms. We've been on the front lines of this. We represented Long and Foster, for example, when they sold to Home Services back in 2017. At the time, it was the largest brokerage acquisition in the history of this industry, and measured by value, that probably remains the largest. We've represented, a lot of the major acquisitions that Compass has made over the last 5-6 years. And so we're seeing how these big companies are paying for brokerage firms, and that obviously drives how we value these firms. How we you value a company based on what a company might pay for them. Even if the purpose of a valuation isn't for a sale, that's how we got to build a valuation, as if you come to us and say, okay, this is what our value is, now go ahead and sell me. So obviously we took part in a lot of the Anywhere acquisitions before they stopped buying brokerage firms. And one thing that's interesting, kind of circling back around into the components of evaluation, is over the last 35 years that we've been doing this, not a lot has changed in the process. The valuation process has remained, very consistent. Now, obviously, multiples ebb and flow based on the state of the market, and we'll talk a little bit more about multiples throughout the course of this webinar. But the process for evaluation hasn't really changed. And I'll dive into that right now, Debbie, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay. So the process of evaluation is, the first thing we do is we understand, okay, what's the basis of evaluation? When we're performing valuations at RealTrends, we really like to understand the history. We don't go back more than about 5 years. We like to get about 4 or 5 years of history to understand trends, operationally, financially, where have you come from to where you are today. But interestingly, the basis for valuation over the last 35 plus years is heavily weighted on the trailing 12 months. This is a what have you done for me lately industry because of the nature of our assets. And so while we like to look at trends, we like to look at history, the key component to evaluation, the key component to basis is trailing 12 months. This is how in M&A, these deals are priced. It's based heavily, if not solely, on trailing 12 months. So we really want to make sure we focus in and understand what's been happening over the last 12 months. And that's how we develop our what's called the EBITDA build. EBITDA, for those who don't know what that means, is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. We can say that in looser terms and say that's the net income or the net operating cash flow. It's what basically, after all the adjustments and expenses, it's what the owner of that firm is making, and it's what, if there's an acquisition, it's what the acquirer can expect to make on a cash flow front. So in the valuation process, we focus on that EBITDA build and understanding how we're going to make the appropriate adjustments to come up with that bottom line net income. And, if I'm speaking to broker owners here, you obviously, you develop your P&Ls or your income statements, and you can see how your bottom line looks. But that bottom line that it shows on your P&L, whether it's through Lone Wolf or QuickBooks or whatever, may not be that same bottom line that your valuation is going to be based on. And because there's, I run a small business. Debbie, you run a small business. Most broker owners that we're talking to here are small businesses. And the vast majority of M&A that we've done, by the way, it's not these large guys, the one that I was talking about. We do a lot of local and regional valuations and mergers and acquisitions, because that's kind of where most of the activity is. The big ones, the ones you read about in the news, those are few and far between. Most M&A is happening on a local scale. And so we run small businesses. We get to do things on the accounting side of things with our small businesses that are tax favorable. So we need to make sure we understand how to make the appropriate adjustments to find out what that true cash flow is for a purchaser. And so there's some common adjustments. And I know you've talked about some of these adjustments with a lot of your clients, Debbie. one of the biggest adjustments is the owner's contribution to the company. When I'm doing a valuation, I want to understand, okay, what is the owner currently contributing to this company? And when I say that, there's multiple aspects of that. Does the owner still list and sell? If they do list and sell, are they leaving their commissions in the company? If they are leaving their commissions in the company, we need to make sure we make the appropriate adjustments for that to either adjust that out or to adjust that to a market rate. Are the owners paying themselves fair market wages for their operating role? If they don't list and sell and they're just operators, what kind of a salary are they paying themselves? Is it something that's according to market? Is it way above? Is it way below? Some owners don't pay themselves anything. They just take distributions on the back end. So we need to make sure we normalize owners' compensation to a level that's commensurate with what the market is. What's the owner running through the company that's personal or discretionary? I run stuff through my company that that I would consider personal and discretionary, that if somebody else owned my company, I wouldn't expect them to pay for. Shoot, I mean, we've seen all kinds of stuff when we do valuations. We've seen owners run through their boat and yacht expense, personal boat and yacht expenses. I had a valuation recently where the owner was running through their child's college tuition through their company. The IRS probably wouldn't be too happy about that. I don't care. I'm not the IRS. So when I'm doing a valuation, that doesn't bother me. Obviously when we're going through the process, we add that back as just an owner personal or discretionary expense. And so we want to make sure we really dial in and understand what owners are running through the company, get that adjusted as appropriately. Normalizations. Normalizations is a big adjustment that might need to be made in the process of our EBITDA build. Have you recently opened an office? Have you closed an office? We want to make sure we understand what that additional expense is, or the expense savings might be based on that change that's recently made to your occupancy, to your footprint. We want to take a close look at personnel. Have you recently made a hire? Have you recently terminated a position that you don't plan on replacing? Those two situations, if we normalize those, could decrease or increase the value, because we want to make sure we understand what your fixed expenses are on a go-forward basis. And the employee roster is a big thing we like to focus in on. Are there non-recurring or one-time expenses that we should take into account as we're building, that cash flow, as we're building that EBITDA? Is there did you spend money over the last 12 months developing a new website that's not going to be a recurring expense going forward? Did you cancel a vendor contract? Did you add a new one? Were there expenses for office renovations that you didn't capitalize, that you just ran through your income statement, that we might need to consider as a one-time or non-recurring expense? So you got to make sure we understand that. And then also one of the last things we'll look at, Debbie, is agent, in and out reports, is what we call it. What kind of activity is there on your recruiting front, if you're losing agents? No matter how good your brokerage firm is, you're going to lose agents for one reason or the other. Whether it's them retiring, going to another brokerage firm, whatever, you're going to lose agents. And our goal as broker owners, obviously, is to replace those, not only to replace the agents that are departing, but also to continue to grow our agent count over time. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in some other areas that we'll discuss. But if we see, as we're going through the valuation process, that there's an imbalanced loss of agents, then we might need to make an adjustment on that front. So we go through all these adjustments to build our EBITDA, to understand what the cash flows of that company. And then we figure out, okay, is this, after we go through that process, is this company profitable? Over the last, 4 or 5 years, most brokerage firms have been profitable. And so in that case, we got to determine, okay, what approach are we going to use in valuing this company? And the most common approach is the income approach. In very simple terms, it's just a multiple of that adjusted cash flow or that adjusted EBITDA to determine the value. If your company is not profitable over the last 12 months, for whatever reason, doesn't mean there's no value. There's still value in companies, even if your bottom line is in the red over the last 12 months. As long as you've got agents that are producing, there is going to be value in your brokerage firm. And we'll look at more of a top line approach in that case. It's called either the gross margin approach or the company dollar approach. And so we'll take a top line approach at that and make sure we really understand what your adjusted company dollar is. And then obviously, to determine that value, that's when we apply the multiple. And that's, the multiple is the big subjective factor of how we put the valuation together. Factors that affect the multiple, what we also call factors that affect marketability. Like I mentioned, owner's contribution to the company, that's a big factor, especially in smaller brokerage firms, that could affect what that multiple is going to be. Is that owner not involved in sales? Are they involved in sales? Depending on that level of involvement could drive whether that multiple is higher or lower. What's aside from the owner, what's the concentration of sales amongst your sales force? Do we have in every brokerage firm, no matter how big they are, you're going to have your, top, 25% of agents doing 75% of the business. That's very normal. Are the top 5% of your agents doing 75% of the business? That would be an imbalanced concentration. So we want to make sure what that concentration looks like. Size matters in multiples, right? I mean, obviously, the bigger you are, the more scale you have, the less risk there is. So you're going to tend to have a little higher multiple if you're a larger brokerage firm. What kind of market are you operating in? Are you in a major metropolitan area? Are you in a rural area? That could affect the valuation. What's your market share? If you're a small up and coming brokerage firm that's growing fast in a major metro area, there's a lot of room to grow. Like we mentioned before, what do those trends look like? What do the trends look like over the last 5 years, and how do those differ from what the market's been doing? Obviously, if you're in a market downturn, not every firm's going to have an upward trend. Some might. Some are, a lot of firms, especially I bet your clients, Debbie, are market outperformers. So we got to consider those trends, commensurate with what the market is doing. Consistency, leadership is a big aspect in how we affect the multiple. What's the role of the leadership? Is the operator of the company, the owner of the company, and what's their role going to be if it's a sale? If that person is very much involved in operations, is still a big figurehead, yet they don't want to be there or don't plan on being there after acquisition, that could affect how we value the company as well. But the number one absolute most important factor in multiples, and we talked about this a little bit before, and that's why I wanted to talk about kind of the history in the context of what's going on in the market is comparables. Like an agent buys or sells a home, comparables are a big factor in how we price that home. In valuations, comparables is by far the biggest factor. What's happening in the M&A market? What's going on in our industry that drives multiples right now? What are the big buyers paying for brokerage firms right now? In our experience, what are we seeing on a regional scale in the M&A that's happening, and on the local scale? So comparables is a big factor, and so that's one of the things we consider. So there's a lot of different things that can drive multiples. Obviously, in a business where your assets are independent contractors, I hate to call people assets because people aren't assets, but for all intents and purposes, we'll just call them the assets of your business. The values in our industry aren't going to be as high as like in the tech industry or in the manufacturing industry or some larger, some different microchips, whatever. We're not going to have as high multiples, and multiples can range wildly depending on what things are happening in the market and depending on the factors that affect marketability that we talked about. And those multiples can range between 1.5 to 4.5, and we talk a little bit more about that in that ebook, Debbie, that we'll be offering to people that are on the call and to your clients. So those are the components of evaluation, and what goes into evaluations, the things we consider when we're going through the process, and how we go about putting that report together and delivering that product to somebody that is either interested in valuing themselves or maybe valuing a possible target for an acquisition. So I'll stop right there to see if you have any questions. If you want me to expand on anything that we discussed before we go on to kind of the next area.
Yeah, go ahead and throw those in the chat box or come off mute. We'd love to hear your voices. A couple of things that I heard there, Scott, and that I have spoken with some of my clients about is, one, you wait too long typically to get a valuation. Like you're saying, you wait until that point in which you're saying, maybe I'd like to be acquired, or maybe I would like to go acquire someone, but I really don't know what to look at from their side. So I should probably go get a valuation of my own. Then I know what to go look at to see what they have put together. And so that waiting too long to me, and I know I've sent several clients your way that are considering it 10, 15 years down the line, but now they have their books in order. They're backing out, maybe not in their tax records, but on paper somewhere, backing out their commissions, backing out salary, like what would they have to pay someone to replace themselves, considering, taking out the yachts, the college funds, all the things that way, but really digging into what is this company worth, which I think when we look at it, we're like, oh, I'm at a 50, 60, 70% profit margin. Well, kind of, but you can't pay yourself twice. So,
That's exactly right.
Some of those key pieces. And then the other thing too, I've heard you and Steve talk about from the stage is really gone are the days of your COVID numbers impacting your value when you're looking at someone that's going to come in and acquire you. And I think that's true for our teams. Our teams are starting to feel that downward shift in number of sales. We're still seeing the volume high, but you can't rely on what those 2020, 2021, early 22 numbers were to predict what someone will pay for your company, because I've seen it, and I know you and I chatting have seen it, where those numbers, even if it's just the multiplier coming down based on what we can predict moving forward, because that's really what we have to look at. Like you said, it is purchasing people, so we have to look at it that way. And then also, I can't say it enough. I know there's a couple of you on my call that know that I'm infatuated with the word recruit. Right. And I call it rescuing. We're going to rescue others from situations that they don't know they're missing out on. So rescuing and continuing that growth strategy is huge in these multiples to keep them going. So those are just a couple of takeaways. I had questions out there. And like Scott said, we are going to go into how this impacts teams as well, because I know we have some teamerages on the call as well to see how those valuations are playing out for those larger teams. So let's talk a little bit further, Scott. What are you seeing with current market changes, with new laws, any impact with buy side? I know it's early. There's probably not much right now yet. We're not seeing too many differences with the buy side compensation piece coming into play, but anything you're taking into account moving forward with those companies looking to acquire?
The impacts of the new laws with this litigation situation we're in haven't completely flowed through. And really, we aren't going to understand how it's going to impact, how it's truly going to impact brokerage valuations, I believe, for 6 to 12 months. I got, with our clients, we've got two kind of differing views of what's going to happen here. We've got, on one hand, we've got some of our clients who think, this is no big deal. Nothing's going to change. It's going to be business as is. We're not going to see any decline in our ability to generate the type of revenue we were generating, and for agents to be able to get the type of commissions they were getting. And then on the other side of thing, on the other side of the coin, we have agents who are actually budgeting a decrease of 100 basis points on the buy side transaction in their forecasting. We see some brokerage firms, especially some big large ones out there, who believe that there could be a significant decline on their buy side, commissions and revenues being generated in the months and years to come, based on how this is going to affect the real estate transaction. So it's going to end up being somewhere in the middle, probably. The effect on valuation truly is going to be, how it's going to affect your revenue. And that obviously drops to the bottom line and how you adjust to that. What this litigation has done is put a significant pause into M&A. And when you have less M&A activity, that obviously is going to affect the multiples. And so multiples have softened absolutely over not only, obviously our industry has been facing some headwinds over the last few years. With the increasing interest rates, decrease in existing home sales, and with this litigation, and these type of headwinds have softened the M&A market. We've seen home services completely exit the M&A market. We've seen Anywhere exited well before this, and some of the other big major buyers out there, some of the PE firms that had been big buyers a few years ago, are either not buying anymore, or being very selective in their acquisitions. So when you get these big players stepping back and waiting to see how the dust settles with this litigation, and not making these acquisitions, then obviously the comparables are going to show that the buyers that are out there don't have as much competition. So when that happens, multiples are going to tend to soften a little bit. And so really it's the M&A activity that's driving multiples down, and it's not material. It's not a huge decrease in the multiples. But we're seeing the biggest change on the M&A side of things is how terms are being agreed upon in acquisitions. But time's going to tell on that one, Debbie, really up to how this litigation affects brokerage valuations. But as of now, it's not anything that's truly significant. It's more of those, let's keep an eye on it. Let's see how we adapt to this. Let's see how agents are doing in selling their value over the next 3, 6, 12, 18 months, and to see how that's truly going to affect their brokerage's ability to generate revenue off of the agent's ability to generate their commission as they're running their businesses. So that's kind of, I mean, there's not a ton of impact at this point now, other than what we're seeing on the M&A side of things.
Do you see this as an opportunity for the smaller companies who want to take on acquisitions to get in the game, even if it's at a lower, like it's actually better because they're purchasing at a lower multiple, where before, and I know with some smaller brokerages that I work with, the thought has always been, well, I'm not big enough to acquire another company. Do you think there's opportunity there?
Oh my gosh, tremendous opportunity. Across the board too, not just for small firms, but we have some of our large, stronger clients are licking their chops right now. And I believe that this next couple years is going to be one of the greatest periods of consolidation in our industry that we're ever going to see. There is tremendous opportunities for firms that are interested in acquisitions. And I know one of the topics we want to talk about is, kind of identifying acquisition targets. And but this industry is going to be fine, and that we're undergoing some changes now. This industry is always ebbed and flowed for one reason or the other, and the companies that are in it for the long run, that still understand the value that there is in doing what we do. I mean, nothing's changed in terms of the consumer's desire to use an agent. I mean, we've done studies ourselves at RealTrends. NAR has recently done a study that shows that over 90% of consumers out there still want to use an agent for their transaction. And that's not going to change. No matter how great technology gets, no matter how much mud gets thrown at us in our industry, the bottom line is consumers want and need an agent to walk them through the process of buying and selling a home. And so if you're a brokerage firm that's in it for the long run that sees that opportunity, there's a lot of weakness out there and a lot of fear out there that you can leverage. And because multiples are softening a little bit and terms are favorable to purchasers a lot more now than they were in the past, it's a great opportunity right now to make acquisitions. And so we've got a lot of clients that are like, hey, Scott, please, if there's somebody in this market that comes to you that's looking for the opportunity to sell their firm, please contact us because we'd be very interested. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity out there, significant amount.
Yeah, that's exciting. Housing is a core need, right? We have to have it, and people pay for convenience, right? They'll pay $40 to get a Chick-fil-A sandwich delivered to their door. So chances are they'll pay for a professional to help them with one of their largest assets.
That's right.
That's the hope of all of it. When you talk about multiples, what would be a multiple for those on the call that don't know what multiples traditionally common in our industry? What would that look like? And then share with us a little bit about those terms. So if someone on the call is interested, of course, contacting you first, right, to get the valuation done on a company they're investigating. But what could some of those terms look like that have changed different from that, hey, here's $1 million, now I want your company?
Great question. So multiples, we'll call it, they'll be in a range between 2 to 4 times that adjusted cash flow we were talking about. Okay. 4 is pretty rare right now. We'll call the mean multiple 3, could be 2, could be lower, could be higher. But a multiple in very simple terms is the value of your company is that multiple, which we'll call it a 3, of your adjusted cash flow. So let's say, you go through the process of valuing a firm that you're interested in acquiring. And that multiple comes out, or that cash flow comes out at $250,000. And so if it's a 3 multiple, then the value of that firm is $750,000. If you're looking at a firm that's doing $100,000 in cash flow, the value is going to be somewhere around $300,000, a multiple of that. So that's 3 times that amount in very simple terms. Now, the big thing that's changed is not necessarily the multiple over the years. Obviously, a firm like Long and Foster had a multiple way higher than that, right? Firms that are not doing well may have lower multiples than that, or if they're not profitable, we'll go to the top line approach for valuation. And that's something that we write about in that book as well. But the terms is what's really changed. So 3, 4, 5 years ago, we were seeing terms of a transaction being, okay, I'll pay you $500,000 for your brokerage firm, and half is going to be up front. We used to see a lot of transactions where you'd say, okay, I'll give you half up front, so $250,000 at closing, and then the rest I'm going to pay you over a period of time. Before the market started to weaken, we'd see these terms look like 50% up front and the rest on a 2 to 3 year earnout. And that earnout is mostly contingency based. It's usually not guaranteed. Every once in a while, we'll see a guaranteed transaction, but that's pretty rare. It's contingency based on the performance of the company. So if your company if the company you acquire continues to perform at the same rate that they did prior to that acquisition, then it would take 2 years to get that next $250,000. The big change that we're seeing in transactions these days is with the risk out there in this market, given the state of the market, given the housing market downturn, high interest rates, whatever, the litigation, rather than 50% down, we're seeing 20 to 25% down. Owners or purchasers are not willing to put that much risk up front. And so we're seeing a lot more of the purchase price being contingency based over a period of time. And it's not now 2 or 3 years, it's now 3 or 4 years, for example. So that $500,000 deal, if the purchase price is still $500,000, rather than 50% up front and the rest over 2 years, we're seeing 20 to 25% up front. So we'll call it $100,000 up front. And that other $400,000 is over now 4 years. So $100,000 a year contingency based on performance. And that really kind of it really hedges the risk for a purchaser of making an acquisition. If they got to look at, okay, what's going to happen with this market over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years? I want to make sure I have the ability to pay for this acquisition if there's a downturn in the market or the business doesn't perform like it had over the last 12 months over the next 4 years. So terms are favoring purchasers now. And so that's where we've seen the biggest change in M&A is on the term side of things.
Yeah, and I know in the property management space, working with some of those larger companies, I've seen where they don't hit the mark this year, they'll add the $25,000 to the back end of the contract type of thing. It just extends the time, but gives that company the opportunity to collect all that the deal entailed initially. What are you seeing with leadership stay in place with that length of a contract? Is that something then leadership would stay in order to ensure that continued success?
Leadership is a very important part of the acquisition process. Not only when you are prospecting and making acquisitions, leadership is what could be initially draw you to a firm. When you make an acquisition, you want to make sure that you make an acquisition of a firm that's got a very similar culture to yours. Obviously it's going to be priced based on the cash flow that company generates, but the interest in that firm and maybe even a premium being paid goes into the quality of that firm and the culture and the leadership that's in place. And your desire to have that existing leadership continue to serve the role that they had prior to the acquisition. Now, some sellers want to sell because they'd want to phase out. And even if you want to phase out, that obviously is something that needs to be clearly outlined and clearly defined through the acquisition process. But even if you do want to phase out, when that acquisition is made, the leadership, if the owner is in leadership, if the owner is still the face of the company, if they're the CEO, if they're the broker, whatever, they're the ones still leading the sales meetings, they still need to serve in some kind of a transitionary role, whether that's for 6 months or a year, even if they want to phase out. So if you're a seller, you need to make sure if you're still involved in this company and you still have an active operational role, you need to plan on being with that company after the acquisition for a period of time in order for you to get the maximum value on that brokerage, on the sale of your brokerage firm. So again, from a purchaser's perspective, I want to acquire this company and I don't want breakage. I don't want agents leaving because the owner is gone all of a sudden. I want that owner to support the acquisition, to continue to show up at sales meetings and continue to support the agents that they had developed at the time of the sale. So ownership remaining on and serving in an operational role, if they had an operational role prior to the acquisition, is very important. And like I said, it could only be 6 months. The acquisition could be developed to where we've got a good plan in place. There's a good transition strategy in place, and we're comfortable with this owner fading off in 6 months. But that owner does need to serve an operational role.
That's interesting, especially as it's gotten longer. The leaders in place. I think that's one of those pieces where I've spoken with agents of large teams or leadership of brokerage, and they're like, no, I'm ready. 2 years, I'm done. And I'm thinking, well, let's get this ball rolling. Those are the people you're talking to for sure.
Oh, yeah.
To set them up for success. So transitioning to that, targeting the right acquisition, and you mentioned culture, you mentioned some of those value items that these acquiring brokerages offer to these other brokerages who may be looking to either transition out of the business or align with a larger brokerage firm. How do we go find the right acquisition target? Who are we looking for?
That's the key right there. Obviously, what we tell owners who are looking to make acquisitions is obviously, and this is intuitive, but you'd be surprised that it's people who actually don't know their own market. And we encourage people, whether you're interested in making acquisitions or not, you really got to know your market. You got to understand who out there has got the good reputations. We got to understand who's got the good talent, who's got good trends going, in transactions. So knowing your market is a huge facet of that. And in acquisitions right now, especially in the local scale, which is the majority of transactions, is the low-hanging fruit is these roll-ins. And, quick explanation of what a roll-in is. You've got acquisitions, you've got mergers, and you've got roll-ins. Acquisitions are where you go through the whole legal process and you acquire the company. There's a big purchase agreement. You're taking on leases. You might be you're taking on employees. You're taking on liabilities of the previous company. It gets a little more complex. It takes longer to close a transaction like that. It might cost a little bit more. The roll-ins are the sweet spot right now. So that a lot of that consolidation is going to be we'll call it an acquisition. That's not really an acquisition. It's really a small firm that you're rolling in. Sometimes people call them tuck-ins or walkovers, where you're not really taking on much liability. You're not necessarily taking on a lease. If there's an office that you're interested in, but you want to take over the lease, you have some kind of an agreement with the owner where you write them a check for it instead of you putting your name on the lease. You're not really taking on any employees. You're just kind of bringing those agents over to your brokerage firm for a good place for them to land, because that owner isn't necessarily interested in operating a brokerage firm anymore. Really, these roll-ins are the sweet spot, because the truth is 70% of all brokerage firms out there have 10 agents or less. So when you're looking at your market and you're trying to figure out who these acquisition targets are, you need to look at these smaller brokerage firms where the owners still list and sell. Those are your targets. Those are the companies that can be the roll-ins, that are the easy acquisitions that could be quick, where the payment on those is really heavy on the earnout, on the override, and there's not a lot to pay up front. It's owners who are frustrated with this market. They kind of backed in to owning a brokerage firm. They might have. I call it sometimes teamerages, right? Where you got a really good agent or team that all of a sudden they wake up and they've got 10, 20, 30 agents working for them. And they're figuring out that the operational hassles that they've woken up to is not what they're interested in. They're interested in what they love, which is listing and selling and doing their own business. And when you get these extraneous forces like the litigation situation, like high interest rates and more complex transactions, they'd rather have that operational burden land on somebody else. So those kind of companies, those teamerages, are really those sweet spots. So look at those smaller companies in your market that have, 10, 20 agents or less, where the owner still lists and sell. Those ones are probably the most willing to do a transaction, because they're getting frustrated with operating a brokerage firm. It's getting harder and harder to do it. Obviously, as you know your market, you know who the sunsetters are. You know which broker owners out there in your markets are coming towards retirement and may not have a succession plan, may not have an exit strategy, and who you might be a good option for them. Agent anecdotals. In talking to your agents, if you're a good leader, whether you're a team leader or broker owner, and you're talking to your agents, who do they enjoy working with the most on the other side of the closing table? You're going to get that feedback from these agents as to what the good firms are there who align with yours culturally. In identifying candidates, there's some things you really want to make sure that kind of line up before you really start going down the process of trying to engage for a sale. We talked about this before, Debbie. You got to make sure that there's a cultural alignment there. And you're going to know that based on reputation, whether it's in the market or whether it's from your agent feedback. You got to have a significant cultural alignment. You may not know that until you meet with the owner to figure out is this a person that you would have over to your house for dinner? Is this a person that you enjoy having a glass of wine with or taking a walk with or cup of coffee, whatever? You'll figure out that a lot of times in the first meeting. We also recommend, as you're considering an acquisition, that you don't try and target firms that have a wildly different compensation structure than yours. There's a lot of different models out there now, and our general rule of thumb is if you think that this firm has got a greater than 5% difference in their retained company dollar, then it's probably not something that you want to go after, solely because if you get this big wide spread of commission, whether it's splits or fee-based, that you've got agents coming in comparing their plans to your agent's plans, then you're just going to have nothing but trouble. Obviously, synergies is a big aspect of making an acquisition. Identifying targets within your footprint, and again, when we recommend to our clients, especially smaller brokerage firms who are looking to grow via M&A, we recommend don't necessarily go outside your footprint to start off with. Even larger firms, if you're in major metro areas, don't go outside your footprint. Look within your footprint. What kind of synergies might there be where you can see cost savings on the occupancy side of things, personnel side of things, back office side of things. So look for synergies. And then when it comes to engaging, this is just like recruiting, Debbie. It's about relationships. When you are a buyer as a brokerage or a team looking to acquire another team, it's all about relationships. Treat M&A like recruiting. Make certain touch points. Now, I have one client who makes it a point to say every Christmas send to the other broker owners in town at Christmas, hot chocolate, marshmallows, and peppermint sticks. Just to kind of, hey, here, how you doing? Or to congratulate them if they make a big transaction. Know what your competitors are doing and make those relationships. And those relationships start with phone calls and meeting in person. You can't send an email out to somebody to say, are you for sale? That's never, ever going to work. In fact, it's even if you meet somebody in person, don't ask them if they're for sale. There's strategies and ways you could talk to them about getting them to a point where, they might be interested in pursuing a combination. We call it a combination of some sort. So, hey, you meet with somebody and you say, hey, look, are you, I really like the way you do business. I think that, I think if we had some kind of a combination, we could have more fun. We could make more money. We could do better together. So there's ways you could talk to people. But again, it's about relationships. It's about like what you would do if you're a broker owner recruiting agents. And so, and I kind of mentioned this before, Debbie, sellers in today's market are a little different than sellers 3 or 4 years ago. 3 or 4 years ago, brokerage firms were worth more than they'd ever been worth. And so a lot of sellers were opportunistic and they wanted to monetize what they'd built. And so, they were out there selling at the peak of the business they built. Sellers today, there's some who might try to be opportunistic based on their success, but a lot of sellers, and again, this is that low-hanging fruit, this is that opportunity for consolidation, might be selling out of necessity. Or, because they're not doing well financially. They might be selling out of necessity because, something's happening, in their market or with their family or whatever, or it's pure capitulation. They're surrendering. They don't want to operate a brokerage firm in this market anymore. They don't have the gumption that you do to do it. They still operate, they still list and sell, and they just want to focus on their own business. So they're more than happy to hand over their operations to you as the purchaser. One of the things we tell teams if you're looking at making an acquisition, is the team that you're acquiring, make sure there's an element of transferability there. How are they generating their leads? Is there transactional value in the process of going through acquiring another team? There's a whole bunch of different elements there that could be different to a brokerage in terms of valuing a team and making those acquisitions. One thing we tell both teams and brokerages: before you do M&A, make sure that your internal house is in order. And I know this is one of the things you preach significant, Debbie, is make sure you got a good organic growth strategy of your own before you go out and try and do M&A. You're selling yourself to other firms when you're trying to make acquisitions. So obviously make sure your internal house is in order before you go on the M&A work path. So those are just some ideas on how to identify targets in your markets and how to approach them, who to maybe target.
Yeah. And I love that, because I do hear, just out in talking with some of our clients, these teamerages that are at that point where they're not sure what's going on with the settlement and the additional lawsuits. And they're at that, I'm just going to throw my hands up and I'm going to surrender, and I'm just going to go with a firm. We're going to protect ourselves underneath the firm. I don't want to handle the liability, the questions, all the things that are coming with what's going on right now. So I have definitely seen some opportunity there with more of those smaller to mid-size teamerages. And then the other thing I'm hearing, or I'm getting questions around, is the word partnership. So instead of going through M&A or roll-in, what does it look like for me to find someone to partner with? And I know that's not on our agenda, but what are your thoughts around partnerships between agents? I know it all comes down to the clear understanding of who does what in this partnership and how that continues to grow, or is one retiring, all the things. What are your thoughts around partnerships, and what would that look like financially for those two partners, if you have anything on that?
In brokerage M&A, the vast majority of transactions are acquisitions. We will occasionally see mergers. One of the things, we don't always encourage mergers, because what you're doing is you're going into a partnership for life with somebody. It's a marriage. And you want to make sure that if you do that, there's a really good buy-sell agreement set up, that you're protected. The problem with going into a partnership is somebody's going to lose control. Even if you're a 50-50 partner, you still lose control. So when we recommend to our clients who are interested in making acquisitions but are willing to give ownership to somebody, which is more formally a merger, don't give up majority control. Keep your voting rights. Make sure you protect yourself, and as you design your buy-sell agreement to where if something goes wrong. On the team side of things, that's a lot more feasible to have partnerships. Teams become teams a lot of times out of partnerships. When we do work with teams and we do valuations with teams, the three types of teams that we work with are what we would consider, if we're going to classify them, we call them convenience teams, personality teams, and business teams. And convenience teams are really partners who come together, whether it's husband, wife, mother, daughter, two really top agents who team together to make, to reduce their costs, to scale their business, and to help one another to grow their businesses organically together. Personality teams, or I guess convenience teams, you've got, I guess more a personality team. You got these rainmakers who are so good at generating leads and are so good at bringing in business, they just can't do it themselves. And this is how teams develop from one person to, all of a sudden you got 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 buyers agents. You have to hire transaction coordinators, whatever. You get these big personality teams that, have to grow, and maybe even have to develop partnerships in order to continue to have other people work the leads that they develop, because they've got such big personality and they're such big rainmakers. And so partnerships for personality teams become very important, especially if you want to bring in other listing agents. If you've got a team that's developed where the owner, the rainmaker can take care of all the listings, and you got a whole bunch of buyers agents, then that works really well. But if you've got an overabundance of listings, and you need to bring in a good listing agent, and you're not going to be able to keep a good listing agent unless if you bring them into ownership and make them a partner. So these teams that are growing, that have reliable listing agents that want to do succession planning and want to, build some kind of a legacy within their team, need to develop these partnerships with other listing agents. Obviously, business teams are teams that can generate leads via some kind of a marketing system to where there's a significant amount of transferability there to where the owner doesn't necessarily go out on any listing appointments. They generate a lot of leads based on the marketing systems that they've developed, and they can actually sell that kind of as a brokerage firm. And somebody else could actually kind of jump in and take over that team and generate and convert leads at or similar conversion rate that those teams were doing under previous ownership. So partnerships and teams are a lot more important, a lot more feasible than they are, in my opinion, for brokerages. We discourage, unless if you've got, two young leaders who the synergies are just out of this world, and they own brokerage firms that if they merge together, it just completely makes sense, then it could be a good opportunity for a merger. But we don't recommend partnerships necessarily on the brokerage side of things.
One thing that just came to mind as you were talking, when you think about the valuation piece too, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. Core services, I know that's a big buzzword. Well, it has been for a while, but more so now, and looking at additional revenue streams. How are you seeing that impact? And then what types of core services are these teamerages or even brokerages getting involved with that are adding value? And then I know some of them are keeping them separate when they sell, but what are some of those that you're seeing value adds in?
Yeah, how to build value for brokerages and teams is obviously a big element, I think, what needs to be discussed. And that's, one aspect that you just hit on is, adding other sources of revenue. The truth is, Debbie, in this market, I talked about how 50 years ago, brokers were keeping 50 cents on the dollar. 20 years ago, they were keeping 30 cents on the dollar. And what we're experiencing is significant margin compression. And if you're not growing, you're dying in this industry. And so you've got to figure out ways to build value in your firm and to adapt to the environment they're in, which is margin compression. We are in, margins continue to be squeezed, and there's only so much you can do on the top line. So you've got to figure out how to adjust on the bottom line, how to figure out other sources of revenue, other ways to either grow your business or build value that we're calling, the purpose of the call today. Like you mentioned, other sources of revenue. There's a couple ways to do that. Number one is if you haven't incorporated fees into what you're doing, if you're just purely relying on splits, consider adding fees. I know it's hard to do, but we've seen brokerages be very successful at adding fees. You got to keep up with inflation, really. If you already have fees, or even we've actually seen some brokers, use a CPI adjustment on their splits or their existing fees in order to, to make sure that they're the ones that are not taking on the brunt of inflation on all the services and products that they provide to their agents. So incorporating fees into your business, or at least adjusting fees to inflation, is something that's worked for some brokerage firms. Like you mentioned, adding various levels of affiliated services, whether it's title or mortgage or escrow, depending on what parts of the country, and property management. By the way, my quick recommendation to brokerage firms who are starting property management companies: make sure your property management firm does not have the same name as your brokerage firm, because property management clients are a lot different than brokerage clients, and they go on to Yelp and Google reviews. If something happens with their property, they may not have anything to do with you, and they could smear your name. So make sure that you name your property management firm something different than your brokerage firm. Side note. Anyways, I digress. Insurance, concierge services, now some of those are going to require scale. If you're a super small brokerage firm and not doing a lot of transactions or team, you got to consider the fact that you aren't going to be able to establish a meaningful source of revenue from title and mortgage unless you're running through a bunch of transactions. Look into relocation. Look into, as a brokerage, obviously lead gen, you get to keep more when you're generating the leads. The fastest way to achieve growth is via M&A, obviously, when you're making acquisitions and smart acquisitions. And one of the big things that we tell people also, Debbie, is one thing that you preach to your clients is invest in your agents. Make sure that they are effectively coached and trained so that you can improve their own personal businesses. Because when your agents grow their business from 6 to 7 transactions or from 10 to 12, or from 15 to 20. That's going to benefit you as the broker. So you've got to make effective investment in coaching and training your agents as well. And I know that's a lot of what you provide, but that's a huge aspect of growing value in your brokerage firm, is not only continuing to recruit to replace agents, but to grow your agent count, but to develop those agents. I mean, shoot, that's what we always tell our people who call and want to talk about brokerage, how to build a successful brokerage. There's really 3 simple key pillars to building a successful brokerage. Number 1 is to effectively recruit. Number 2 is to retain and develop. And you got to be able to retain the agents you recruit. You got to develop them to help them grow their businesses. And number 3, spend less money than you're bringing in. So, I mean, that's the 3 kind of simple 3-pillared approach to running a successful brokerage. For teams, this is a huge element of creating value for a team. You've got to make sure you really understand the value of me versus the value of my business. The less value there is in you as the team leader and team owner, the more value there's going to be in your business and your ability to monetize it down the road. Whether that's bringing somebody up internally and selling your business internally and owner financing that to the next generation, whether it's kids or other agents that you trust, or trying to sell it as a business. As you're working to develop value as a team leader, work to, take value away from you. Take yourself away from whether it's you, taking your name out of the business, whether it's taking your picture off the web page, and then also continuing to develop and bringing in agents that can start to take over your listings and being able to convert leads at the rate that you were able to do it. So the less you're worth as a team leader, the more your business is going to be worth from a business standpoint. I know it sounds kind of weird, but if you're really trying to monetize your team as a business and selling that, especially externally, you've got the less value there is, the less impact you have in your business, the more value there's going to be in your business, which is kind of weird, but that's kind of how it is. So those are some ideas on how to build value for your brokerage, how to build value on your team.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So years ago when I was coaching, it was the season of get rid of the property management company. They're killing us. And so everyone got rid of property management. And now we're looking at the market with the number of sales are down, and they're all coming back saying, okay, now remember that property management thing? Let's start from ground zero and get that running again. So we are seeing that influx of people looking to build those property management companies. And I have all kinds of information on that. So reach out to me if you have questions on doing that, all kinds of checklists and course, just like you are, the same thing, because you're exactly right. You can be close, just don't name it the same. Love it. So as we're wrapping up, succession planning sounds like a great place to go. So any additional tips on those that are never going to retire, but will eventually either legacy plan their company to their nephew who doesn't like real estate, or those that will get rid of their real estate team to their team members because it just seems smart? What does that look like? And then we'll open it up to questions for anyone that has questions before we send Scott on his way.
Absolutely. And really, you hit the nail on the head, Debbie, at the very beginning, where you mentioned planning. Planning is the most important aspect of planning your exit strategy, whether it's internal succession planning, whether it's selling your business externally. You've got to plan ahead. You got to plan ahead operationally and financially. You want to make sure you have organized, clean records. I know you preach this to your clients, Debbie, but it is so important to have well-documented productivity reports. Whether you're a brokerage, make sure you have really good, clean productivity reports for all your agents. And if you're a team, make sure you document your lead sources. Make sure you document your conversion rates. Make sure that's very clean and organized and available. So when you do go through this process, it's easy to go through that due diligence that's necessary in order to go through whether it's succession or acquisition. One thing that I think is really important for owners of brokerage firms and team leaders to understand is the power of confidentiality. When you are ready, when you have that target in mind, let's say you've followed Debbie's advice and you've planned ahead, and now you're on that 2-year mark. Okay, my goal is to sell my business in 2 years. Don't tell people. Confidentiality is so important in this business. Don't make it known that you want to sell your business, because that is going to just permeate out there, and it'll scare your agents. They'll be more likely to leave. Keep your intention to succeed yourself, whether it's internally or externally, for selling your business, keep that confidential. Now, obviously, if you are doing an internal succession plan to a family member, that's different, right? There's a whole process involved in that. And you mentioned this too as well, Debbie, getting that person more responsibility, more front facing, and developing kind of that handoff internally. That needs to be something that's progressively known, and that's more, in teams and small brokerage firms that have family succession. But keep it confidential if you're going to sell all the way up till the end. You just got to keep that confidential. Make sure you've got good, knowledgeable, reliable counsel. Have a really good coach that's been through this with their clients. Make sure you know of a good attorney out there who has any knowledge or some knowledge of the real estate industry. Make sure that you've got, at some point, if your company's big enough, you might have a controller or a CFO that you might bring in at some point during the transaction or the acquisition process. Make sure that there's somebody who you could trust and who has your best interest in mind for the whole process. Have a backup plan, and that backup plan might be, this environment right now, it's really hard to sell a firm. So you got to continue to run your business. And understand how value is built. We talked about the elements of evaluation and what goes into maximizing your value. I will tell you, value is not all about the numbers. Even though that's how we're going to end up pricing a transaction, any premium that might be paid or any synergies or interest in your firm, a lot of that goes beyond the numbers. It goes into the culture you're built, the leadership that you have within your company. The human factor is super important in that process, whether it's succession, internal, or some kind of an external exit strategy. So, but planning ahead is the most important part of this, in addition to patience. When you are finally ready to pull the trigger, this process can be slow. It can be onerous. Especially the larger the firm, the more complicated the transaction might be. So you got to make sure you're patient with how that gets developed as well. So those are some key aspects that we tell folks as they're considering going down this path. So they're considering succession planning, legacy planning for their brokerage or team. What to look for, how to consider it, and when to start really moving in that process.
Well, I want to introduce you to all of us. We are not patient. We're realtors.
That is for sure.
Makes me laugh because that
is for sure.
Is that a word?
No, not really. Trust me, that is our biggest roadblock. There's a lot of things that we call deal killers, and one of them and the biggest one is time. Right? Time is the biggest thing that kills deals. When you're doing M&A, if you have any experience in M&A, time is the biggest thing that kills deals. And a lot of times it's some party getting impatient, So yeah, patience is hard.
I love it. Well, Scott, thank you so much for all of this information. I'm going to open it up to you all for just a minute. If you have questions or want to come off mute and ask a question of Scott or just say something, chime in. Hi, Vlad.
Debbie, thank you so much for having Scott on. And Scott, thank you so much for all of the knowledge and the wisdom and the experience that you just shared. It was, I think that this conversation is a must listen for anybody who is either a mega agent or a broker owner. So thank you.
Vlad, appreciate the kind words. In fact, I remember meeting you a few years ago at one of our conferences.
Yeah, Gathering of the Eagles, I think, years ago.
Right.
That's right. Thank you for remembering. A few questions. Question number one, how are ancillary services and the income from ancillary services evaluated during the acquisition process?
In general, if we're doing a valuation for a brokerage firm that's got some kind of an associated or affiliated, we'll call it title company, mortgage JV, insurance business, home warranty, whatever, we tend to give those the same multiple as the brokerage firm. It's not often where the multiple differentiates much. If there's a property management firm, that will tend to really, we'll try to isolate that, and there might be a different multiple on property management. That's been a really good business the last few years. But in general, if there's some kind of an income stream from title or mortgage or insurance or home warranty, then that tends to get the same multiple as the brokerage firm does.
Okay, so the income or the profit just flows in.
That's correct.
To the calculation.
I mean, if it's big enough and we have to do separate valuations for these companies, and obviously if there's different ownership, like if you have a different ownership group from your brokerage company and then you're doing your title company, we might need to do separate valuations. In general, those multiples still may tend to be about the same or close. But yeah, so if it's a situation where the ownership group's the same and the income kind of feeds into the brokerage, it's just going to get the same multiple.
Clear. And then the multiples that you're currently seeing for teams versus teamrages or brokerages. By the way, are you seeing any increased activity in specifically team transitions or acquisitions or whatever word you want to use?
Yeah, I mean, like Debbie said, really over the last 5 years is when we've seen a huge increase in activity in teams, not only interested in developing, value and developing an element of transferability and transactional value for their teams, but also in going out and trying to find and trying to sell their business. There hasn't been as much of a change over the last, we'll call it 12, 18 months. It's really been over the last 5 years, but we're seeing a lot of activity over the last 5 years to where teams are figuring out, okay, we actually have a business here that's got an element of transactional value. And there's different ways to look at that too. Because there's not a lot of teams out there that are pure lead gen machines, right? You're going to have still a vast majority of teams where a big chunk of the business is from the owner's sphere of influence, their personal database, repeat referral, all that good stuff, SOI generated clients. But there's still business value in that if you're intentional about doing that, if you're intentional about what we call a soft transfer. If you figure out, okay, I'm going to sell my business to this agent that's internal, but we are going to do this over a 2-year process, that transition we call a soft transfer, there's going to be more value there than just a referral fee, right? Obviously for most agents and teams and valuing a book of business, if you aren't intentional about it, it's just going to be as simple as a referral fee. That's the only value you're going to have. And that could be, a referral fee could be a good source of income for an agent that's departing and trying to look to hand their book of business off to somebody. But if you're intentional about transferring your business to somebody, even if it's a database or a sphere of influence, that planning aspect is really huge. And if you're planning on a soft transfer or planning to step out as a team leader and step out of doing listings, right? Even if your business is still majority sphere of influence, if you bring in some good listing agents to start to take over your listings, there's actual transactional value there beyond a referral fee. You can actually value that like a business and a multiple of the bottom line. And so the multiples obviously for teams are not going to be as high as brokerages in general, just because of the risk of transfer when that owner does go away. And there's a lot more. We could write a book about this in terms of the value of a team leader and the value of that person's influence on the business. But there's a lot of activity out there for teams right now, and more teams are getting savvy to the business aspect of what they build.
Good. And do you and Steve also play a role in brokering the transaction as well, or simply evaluation or valuation?
We will usually act as an advisor if we get a team that comes to us and say, okay, we're interested in selling our team. We have some targets that we've already identified, and we'll do some sales strategy development with you. Occasionally, Vlad, if it's a larger team and if it's a business team, we'll engage as a full broker. We're aware of some organizations out there that are interested in buying, in purchasing, some of those business teams that are really focused on lead gen and have really strong databases. And so we'll work with teams to broker those kind of sales, but a lot of times it's more of an advisory role, and we'll help you facilitate a transaction with agents or teams that you've already identified in your market, because you know your market better than us. If it's a local transaction, you've built up a good team, you've built up a reputation, you know the other teams in your environment that are going to work best with the agents you have, that are going to work best with the clients you have, and we'll help you We'll help advise you on structuring that deal, on even the negotiation side of things. So we do work with you on that transaction, but more of an advisory role. We don't necessarily, we don't always like to try and go out and try and find a team from scratch if it's a local deal.
What about the broker on the brokerage side? You something similar?
No, we do full on M&A brokerage still, just like we've always done. Steve is still very active on that side of things. And so both of us will still go through the valuation process. And if we have a client who decides they want to sell, then we'll be the broker on that acquisition. And we'll go out there and we'll do our best to find a buyer and to get the price and terms that that our client, and we usually represent sellers, Vlad, that our client believes is an appropriate value for their brokerage firm.
Clear. Debbie, I do have maybe one or two other quick questions, but I don't want to monopolize the time. If somebody else has questions, I'll get back in the queue if there's time.
Right. Do we have any other questions? I think I've got one from Betsy here.
Yeah, so I do. Hey, thanks for sharing. And man, where were you 10 years ago? I have to back. It's like, this should be a requirement. This should be a CE, like, because everybody's plan is just to die, like, hey, I'm done. I'm a sole owner. I have a back end husband who does all the business. And so I love all this information. It's great. And Debbie's just probably like, what is she going to say? One of the things that I really honed in on was, get your internal house in order. So like, are you talking database, financials, all of that? Or what, like, give me some examples of what you mean about getting your stuff together.
Yeah. So what I mean by that is when you are going out and considering an acquisition, when you are considering growth via M&A, you're selling your business to any other businesses that you want to try and bring in. So just like recruiting, right? You're selling your business to an agent you're trying to recruit. You're also selling your business to the firm that you're trying to bring in. So obviously you want to make sure you have your message dialed in as to what you can provide their agents. This is going to be a better solution for your agents because we're going to be able to provide X, Y, Z. One of the key things we really want to try to tell people is make sure that you don't sacrifice what you've built on the organic recruiting front for M&A, because we've seen some people do that. They've abandoned organic recruiting for M&A, and M&A becomes very difficult or it doesn't work out the way they want. And all of a sudden they realize that they are not out there doing their normal recruiting and the process for recruiting internal, one agent at a time. And so that's what we mean by is make sure you don't lose sight of the organic development that you've developed. And also make sure that you have a really good system and product that you can sell to not just one agent that you're trying to recruit, but a group of agents that you're trying to acquire via acquisition. That's what we kind of mean by that.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
You bet.
Debbie, what am I not asking him? What do you want me to ask him?
I want you to take all these notes, Betsy, and keep everything confidential outside of this call.
All right, that sounds good.
Or talking to Scott later, yeah.
Yeah, check.
Always happy to. Always happy to.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Betsy. All right, anyone else before I allow Vlad back in? All right, Vlad, take it away.
Thank you. On your like when you're doing valuations, when you're getting people coming in and asking for valuations, what percent, Scott, are you seeing who are like doing it for just information purposes? Like, I want to know how much my house is worth, or how much my business is worth, versus, oh crap, I need to sell, and now I'm figuring it out. So, like, is it 50-50? Is it 60-40? And you can combine, teamerages, brokerages, teams, everybody together.
That's a good question. So I would say, in general, Vlad, about half of the valuation assignments we get it's made known upfront, we want to sell our business. And so we go through the valuation process to figure out how we're going to price the transaction. Then we go, develop our M&A strategy, whether it's something that they've already have a buyer identified or we serve as their broker. The other half, I would call it pretty even between litigation. So I'd say 20 to 25% of our valuations lately are for litigation purposes, whether it's for death, divorce, partnership disputes, whatever. We've got another element where they're doing estate or tax planning. Call that 10, 15%. And then another 10, 15% that are just doing it to figure out where they're at today. Hey, I built this business. I don't necessarily need to sell right now, but I want to figure out kind of where I'm at to see where because one of the things we provide Vlad and brokerage valuations is a benchmark. How are you performing and some of your key KPIs relative to your industry peers? And so one of the things in going through evaluation is we see, okay, how are you doing compared to your peers regionally for your retained company dollar, for your spending on occupancy, your spending on personnel, your spending on advertising and marketing, your return on revenue on the bottom line. And so we can go through that valuation process, figure out where you're weak, figure out where you can plug some holes and say, okay, this is where you're at now. Here's some ideas on what we could do to get, to improve this value at some point down in the future. So, circling back around, I'd say 10 to 15% of our valuations are for just general business planning. Where am I at today versus those other reasons that I had mentioned.
And if you were to think about the sellers who are like super motivated actual sellers, what percent of your valuation is 10, 20% who are like, we're selling, we just need to know whether this is in the ballpark. They have extreme urgency.
So out of the 50%, I'd say half of those are sellers who are very motivated to sell. Now, not all of those are relying on us to find a buyer for them. We do get sellers who come to us and say, hey, look, I've already got a buyer who I want to sell to. I don't like what they're offering, but I still want this transaction to work out. I really need a third-party assessment of value so I can come to them and say, hey, look, because I know nothing about valuation, so I need to figure out, hey, is what this guy offering me an actual good value? Is it market? Is it what's being paid on the market? Are they undervaluing me? Are they overvaluing me? So I just need this valuation to understand, to make sure to get this transaction home. So that's kind of how we're seeing that breakout.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Scott.
My pleasure, Vlad. Good seeing you.
Likewise.
Well, what it sounds like from all those percentages, there's about 20 to 25% of the people that I can help in growing their value through coaching in order to make them more valuable for those sellers those buyers that want to pick them up in today's market. So yep. There's my shameless plug. Go Dogs, right?
Go Dogs.
All righty. Well, Scott, I know we're at the end of our time, and I truly appreciate you being here, sharing this information with us.